Morning, everybody. We'll get started. So just a couple of announcements. We have in 2 weeks our resident graduation research day on June 10th. And we'll be here in this room all day. We will also have a virtual Zoom option for that. But for faculty and for residents, as many of you that could be here in person, that's our preference. So, and then the day before on June 9th, we will not have grand rounds. We'll have our pictures out front of Mercy again. So we'll send out some email reminders for that. But this morning's grand rounds, our CME color will be green, and I'll turn things over to Dr. Shing.
All right, thank you, Dr. Scannell. So thanks everyone for tuning in virtually and coming in person. And then a huge thanks to Dr. Scannell, Pat, and Balak for giving me a full hour to talk about being a parent. Appropriately, I have bronchitis for my daughter. I'm COVID negative, but I just want to apologize in advance for any coughing spells that are going to happen. How do I advance? There we go. Okay, so I have nothing to disclose. I am a mom, and my husband is a resident, so obviously we have a personal interest in this subject. And this is my last grand rounds, and so I wanted to share the experiences that I've had and everything we've learned in the last couple of years, and also what the data shows our experiences for other people in our profession. So I just want to start off with a couple of opening thoughts to tackle some mental hurdles. First, this is not just a female issue, right? So often we frame being a parent in medicine as something that only women have to deal with. But the reality is that men have children and start their families in training and practice too. And so they may be dealing with some of the things that we're going to talk about here today. The other thing to consider is that there are non-traditional family units. So some physicians may be single parents. Both men and women may want to adopt. They may battle infertility issues. And so this is really not just something that affects women. The other thing to consider is that this is not just a physician issue. So most of us at some point will work with PAs, NPs, OR staff, clinical staff who want to start their families. And their successes in that endeavor directly impact our successes in practice because more and more healthcare functions as a team sport. So I like to think of parenting in medicine as a humans in the workplace issue. And that's the foundational framework I want to set here today. Having said that, obviously there are some things that only women experience, pregnancy, childbirth. And so we do want to consider their unique experiences. We also know that the female presence in orthopedics is steadily increasing. So currently 15% of residents and 10% of professors are women. And we want to keep this pursuit of diversity going. A couple of recent studies in JAMA showed that female patients may actually have better outcomes with female surgeons. And we know from corporate psychology that more diverse corporations tend to have better workplace outcomes and workplace satisfaction. We also know that medical training and early practice coincide with prime childbearing years. A recent study showed that female medical students identified a perceived lack of work-life balance as a major deterrent for going into orthopedics. Now, it's not practical to fully separate work and family life, so this leads to the key question of how we can make it easier for healthcare professionals to integrate the two. So I'm going to present a lot of data today and share some of my own experiences, and hopefully it will generate some good discussion at the end. I've organized this talk in chronological order of issues that are experienced. So we'll start by talking about pregnancy and touch briefly on infertility as well. The first question to ask is when female surgeons are starting families. This is a seminal study from 10 years ago now by Dr. Abigail Hamilton, who happens to be a sports surgeon. And she polled women of multiple specialties, including orthopedic surgeons, and found that on average, female orthopedic surgeons were starting their families at 33 years of age. At the time in the US, the average age women were having their first child was 25 years old. And so obviously orthopedic surgeons were older when they were starting their families compared to the national average. In this sample, 60% of women said they were happy with when they had their first child, but 37% of them wanted to have children earlier. This number was replicated in a more recent study by Dr. Selena Poon out in California. She polled just orthopedic surgeons through RJOS and had a large sample of 800 women. And she found too that the average age these women had started having children was about 34 years. Now, in the last 10 years, the US average has increased substantially, and so women are starting to have children at a later age, but you can see still that female orthopedic surgeons are starting their families later than the national average. In Dr. Poon's study, she also found that a high proportion of women were delaying having children for their career and until training was complete, and a large proportion were currently delaying having children. Of the women who did not have children, 18% of them explicitly stated that orthopedics was a barrier to them starting their families. Dr. Mary Mulcahy down in Tulane also published a recent study looking just at female orthopedic residents and found similarly a large number of them were deferring having children. The most common reasons they cited were not wanting to miss any training time, not wanting to miss any family time. So again, we have this theme of perceived lack of work-life balance. 20% of them stated wanting to defer children due to this potential negative perception by their colleagues. And then another 20% were delaying simply for personal preference. Now I'm going to take a quick sidestep here to talk about this idea of negative perceptions by colleagues. So in this study, 31 women were either pregnant or already had children. 60% of them reported having experienced negative bias towards them by their co-residents, and 50% of them had negative bias experiences from their attendings. Here's just a representative sample of the things that have been said to women in the past. So these are things attendings have said. One attending joked about requiring birth control for all female residents. Another said that women surgeons would make terrible parents because they were not home to nurture their children. And in another program, pregnant fellows that arrived were treated more negatively. They were given less opportunities and had less attention paid to them. Here are some things that co-residents have said to women. One woman reported she was told it was selfish for a female to get pregnant in residency, and multiple co-residents made comments about making the call pool worse if a woman were to get pregnant. So here we see this common theme of people not wanting female surgeons to miss training or call. But an important thing to point out is that women themselves don't want to miss any training time. They don't want to miss any call. And so then the next logical question is whether or not missing training time actually impacts training outcomes. This is a summary study that came out of the UK. And what they found was that pregnancy during training is not associated with an increased risk of attrition. It doesn't affect case numbers, and it doesn't affect pass rate for exams. And in fact, women are not actually missing that much time. So again, from Dr. Poon's study, the women reported staying in the call pool until an average of 37 weeks gestation, which is full term. They operated until an average of 36 weeks, and they stayed in clinic for an average of 38 weeks. So they're not really missing that much time at all until maternity leave. Now let's look at how men compare. So this is a recent study that polled orthopedic residents, both men and women, and they were asked if they were delaying having children because of residency. And so what I want to point out is that a majority of female residents said that yes, they were delaying having children, whereas only 38% of male residents said they were delaying having children. They were also asked why they were delaying. And so the first thing I'll show is that both men and women cited limited time and financial constraints as a reason to delay. And neither men nor women wanted to negatively impact their residency training. But again, I'll point out that a much larger proportion, 86% versus 63% of women were worried about missing training time as compared to the men. Now here's the real difference. So less than 1% of men were worried about their reputation among colleagues compared to 57% of women. And less than 8% of men were worried about their future career opportunities compared to 42% of women. So the co-residents were also asked to rate parental leave as being quote unquote difficult. And you'll see that maternity leave was rated by 55% of co-residents as being difficult, whereas only 28% of co-residents felt that paternity leave was difficult. And this was a significant difference. So this study concluded that men are less likely to delay having children, and when they do, it's for slightly different reasons. And they certainly experience fewer negative perceptions from their co-residents than their female counterparts do. Now, just briefly about fertility. So luckily, we actually have a study in orthopedics that looks at this topic. Again, coming from Dr. Poon's data sample, 88% of the pregnancies in this study were conceived naturally. So that means 22% of them were conceived with infertility services. Compare that to the national average of just 9% of pregnancies that are conceived with IVF. 51 of the women in the study also reported issues preventing conception, most commonly advanced maternal age, health-related issues, and simply failing multiple rounds of assistive reproductive technology. Now, this study did not identify any risk factors for these increased rates of infertility in orthopedic surgeons. They looked at birth control use, birth control type, age while trying to conceive, hours spent standing while operating in professional stage at birth. None of these were associated with higher rates of infertility. So obviously we need to do some more studies to identify some potential risk factors. Female orthopedic surgeons do experience higher rates of pregnancy complications than the average woman. The estimated frequency is 25 to 31% of pregnancies for female orthopedic surgeons, and compare this to the national average of just 13 to 17%. Even when you adjust for advanced maternal age, where the national average is 21% of pregnancies having complications, female orthopedic surgeons still have higher rates of complications. In Dr. Hamilton's study, she actually matched age, race, and SES to women of the general population and found that being a female orthopedic surgeon incurred a relative risk of 2.5 for experiencing a pregnancy complication. These complications are primarily preeclampsia, preterm labor, and preterm delivery. And we think that simply working longer hours might be a risk factor. So in one study, working more than 60 hours per week conferred an odds ratio of almost 5 for having a pregnancy complication. Female orthopedic surgeons also experience higher rates of congenital anomalies compared to the national average, and they experience higher miscarriage rates. So in one study, 33% of women, that's 1 in 3, experienced a miscarriage. And compare this to the national average of 25%, which is already high, but not as high. And then of all the women who experienced a miscarriage in this study, 28%, only 28% informed their employer, and only 8% even took time off during or after experiencing a miscarriage. So this is a seminal study from 1990. It compares female residents, including orthopedic residents, to the wives of their male co-residents, with over 4,000 women in each sample. Not surprisingly, the female residents were older when they started having children. They were more likely to have fewer children at the time of study administration. And they were working 30 to 40 hours more per week compared to the wives of the male residents. They were also more likely to experience antagonism from their colleagues, and this was measured on a 5-point scale where 1 represented feeling supported and 5 represented feeling antagonized. And they were more likely to experience pregnancy complications, primarily in the form of premature labor that required bed rest, preeclampsia, eclampsia, or other forms of bleeding. I do want to point out, though, that the wives of male residents were more likely to experience placental abruption as a complication. So as orthopedic surgeons, we do have to think about occupational hazards. And this topic was actually covered really well by Dr. Nicole Haynes now 6 years ago. So I'll only touch on it briefly. But for us, we think primarily of methyl methacrylate, cement, and radiation as our prime occupational hazards. Regarding cement, acute toxicity to animal models occurs at about 1,000 parts per million. And a given average total hip, the maximum concentration is about 280 ppm, and this decreases rapidly over 11 minutes to just 10 ppm. So one of the conclusions from Dr. Haynes's grand rounds was that there's an overall low exposure risk to methyl methacrylate with likely low adverse effects on pregnancy. And if we use good protection and good techniques like wearing hoods and vacuum mixing, this can help. Radiation is probably our biggest occupational hazard. So the ACOG recommends fetal exposure of less than 5 rads or 50 milligrams over the course of an entire pregnancy. Anything higher than that, especially during organogenesis, leads to increased rates of organ malformation. And there's a cumulative effect here. So fetuses exposed to more than 50 milligrams throughout a pregnancy are at an increased risk of childhood and lifetime cancer. So for that reason, the International Commission on Radiological Protection recommends less than 1 milligram of exposure to a fetus over the course of a full pregnancy. We use lead aprons to help protect us. The standard lead apron blocks 96% of radiation, but some studies have shown that even just the standard lead apron doesn't fully protect the abdomen from radiation exposure. We also have double and maternity aprons available, which block more percent of radiation, but they also weigh much more, and so you have to consider the cost of physical demand to a pregnant female. So for radiation, we know that it's a true hazard, and the doses do add up, so it's really important that we use appropriate protection. Moving on to issues in the postpartum period, primarily leave and breastfeeding and pumping. Here's how I like to think about parental leave, because when you get into the weeds of it, the legal and financial logistics can be confusing, but I simply break it down into what am I getting? So how much time do I get, and do I get paid with benefits? And if so, how much am I getting paid? And then also, what is it costing me? So is it costing vacation time, training time, revenue if I'm in practice? The American Academy of Pediatrics, as well as multiple public health organizations internationally, recommend that parents take at least 12 weeks of time for infant and family bonding, and even longer to promote exclusive breastfeeding. Many studies have showed that longer leave periods are associated with decreased infant mortality, decreased postpartum depression, increased breastfeeding time, and increased vaccination rates. And this is true as an independent predictor for paternity leave, even when controlling for maternity leave. So this is a map of the countries in the world that offer different amounts of paid leave to mothers. And you'll see that the US is the only developed country, and one of the only countries, period, that offers no paid leave to mothers. Canada and Eurasia lead the way with offering more than a year of time to mothers, and even Russia offers over a year of paid leave to their mothers. This is what the map looks like for paternal leave. More countries do not offer incentivized paternal leave, but you'll see that countries like Canada, some European countries, and Japan do offer bonuses for fathers to share in the parental leave. These are some key definitions we have to talk about when we're talking about parental leave. So, as I've already said, the federal government doesn't offer paid leave to mothers. Employers are required to provide 12 weeks of leave, but it's unpaid. The ABOS requires that orthosurgery residents have complete 46 weeks of training per year, but this can be averaged over 5 years, so you can take more in 1 year and less in another year. GME and residency programs are individually able to create their own policies, and the ACGME just requires that these policies be available in writing to interviewees. Now, this is going to change in a few short weeks. So come July 1st of this year, the ACGME is requiring that all accredited programs actually offer 6 weeks of paid leave to their residents, and this can be used starting the very first day of training. So how much time is offered to ortho residents? Well, I actually think that it's increased slightly over time because back in 2016, this was a study published in the HSS journal where they talked about parental leave for residents as really just a fringe benefit. Only 55% of programs offered parental leave beyond vacation time back in 2016. More recently, this is a study that actually looked at all orthopedic program websites and email program directors to ask if there were parental leave policies. They found that 91% of all of the programs had some kind of parental leave available. 21% of these programs offered designated pay for parents. But 30% of them compensated the residents through some kind of sick leave pay. And when it came to duration of leave, most of these programs deferred to FMLA, which again offers 12 weeks of time. But this study, again from Dr. Poon's group in 2020, found that the average paid leave offered to both residents and practicing surgeons was about 4 to 5 weeks, with the range from 0 to 24 weeks and partial to full pay. So, like I said, I think that the amount of leave we're offered has increased over time, but I think it's also important to look at what other employers offer. And so these are some major companies in Charlotte. This was a Axios Charlotte article that was just published this year. You can see Wells Fargo offers up to 16 weeks of paid leave for a primary caregiver and 4 weeks for a non-primary caregiver. Bank of America offers 16 weeks of paid leave, and Lowe's offers 10 weeks of paid maternal leave and 2 weeks for non-maternal leave as well. Here's an example of what a national standardized policy could look like. So this comes from the American Board of Plastic Surgery. They offer their residents 12 weeks of personal leave throughout residency. And so this can cover parental leave, foster care adoption, medical leave, or even studying abroad if they want to. And it doesn't have to be taken in any single block of time. It can be spread out over their 6 years of residency. And even once the resident uses up all of the 12 weeks, they're still allowed to take time off. They just have to pull from their 4 weeks of vacation per year. So now let's look at how much time parents are taking. For sure, male residents take less time than female residents, 0.8 weeks, so less than 1 week compared to 4.6 weeks. Female residents take less time than female practicing surgeons. In 2012, this was estimated about 4 weeks versus 7 weeks. And again, it's increased slightly over time, with residents now taking about 6 weeks and surgeons taking a little under 10 weeks. But a common theme in the literature is that there's this discrepancy in the amount of resident leave that's offered versus taken. So again, few men take leave, and when they do, it's not to the full capacity offered. In one study, 61% of program directors said that residents were not using the leave that was offered, and when they did, not to the full capacity. Dr. Mulcahy found that only 23% of female residents were even aware of a leave policy at their institution. Okay, so now talking about the costs of taking leave. We've already established that from an educational standpoint, there does not seem to be an effect on attrition, case volume, or board pass rates. Socially, we've seen that women worry more about negative perceptions and are in fact viewed more negatively by their co-residents. What about their program directors? Well, this is a study on ortho program directors through ABOS Cord. 61 PDs participated, and they were asked if they felt that pregnancy and parenthood had an effect on resident scholarly activities. What you'll see is that 53% of male PDs said yes, female residents are affected, compared to only 35% of these male PDs saying yes, male residents are affected. And you'll also note that female PDs did not show this discrepancy in bias. This study also found that more program directors believed that pregnancy and parenthood imposed a burden on fellow trainees for female residents than male residents, and this was a significant difference. So women are viewed more negatively by male program directors as well, as a general point. Okay, financial costs. Again, we're lucky enough to have a study that actually looks at this in the orthopedic literature. This comes again from Dr. Poon's large database of female orthosurgeons. They were asked to estimate the financial burden of maternity leave to them, so lost earnings, overhead, etc. And these women reported losing an estimated average of $41,000 for each leave period. There's a huge difference between resident and surgeon costs. So residents estimated losing just $150 and surgeons estimated losing $45,000. In this study too, 20% of practicing surgeons continued to pay overhead during their leave period. This might not be in accordance with best practice policies. So this is a statement that came out at the end of last year from the American College of Surgeons. And it says that the surgeon should not be responsible for costs to the practice during the period of leave. If their compensation is based in part or entirely on RVUs, they shouldn't be penalized for a decrease in RVUs directly related to parental leave. The study also performed some regression modeling, looking at what saved women money and what cost them more during leave. Obviously, waiting after training was a huge predictor of cost. And then each additional week of leave that they took also incurred a cost. Here are some protective factors. So if the practice or the hospital offered them more paid leave, that saved them some money. And then also in this study, stopping clinic later helped save them money as well. In this study, the timing of stopping call and operating time was actually not associated with cost incurred during leave. And so this leads us to ask, maybe it's okay for us to stop taking call and operating whenever we want, as long as we keep our clinic running for as long as possible. But really what this study suggests is that maybe it's more beneficial for both men and women to have children in training as opposed to waiting until they're in practice. Okay, now talking about breastfeeding. So the WHO, the AAP, and the CDC all recommend that if a woman is willing and able, that she breastfeed for 6 months exclusively and up to 1 year in order to supplement solids. Now, we all know that there are benefits of breastfeeding to both infants and mothers. As a whole, orthopedic surgeons are not breastfeeding for as long as is recommended. Trainees are able to breastfeed for about 4.7 months, practicing surgeons for about 8 months, and only 42% of women in Dr. Hamilton's study were able to breastfeed for that minimum recommended amount of 6 months. Some reported barriers in the literature, women cite lack of facilities to pump, lack of time, because when you breastfeed, you have to pump every 3 to 4 hours to maintain your supply. You also have to take time to actually eat and drink for caloric purposes. Many women felt unsupported by their colleagues. And here again, that theme of awareness, many of them were unaware of existing policies. So in Dr. Mulcahy's study, 48% of residents didn't know of any existing facilities in their institutions, and 75% of them were unaware of a potential scrub-out policy. Looking at policy awareness, this is a study recently published that reviewed all of the websites for orthopedic residency programs and looked at if there were any published breastfeeding policies on the websites. Only 2.8% of programs had written policies available. 20% essentially deferred to GME websites with written policies, and only 1.7% of them mentioned any dedicated lactation facilities. We don't have a study that looks definitively at the number of resources for orthopedic surgeons, but this is that study again with the program directors showing that about 61% of them said that there were facilities for breastfeeding at their institutions. Okay, moving on to issues in parenthood. I want to talk about this idea of family call, which in one study was defined as additional household responsibilities that could create an environment of competing priorities for female surgeons, which may then reduce the amount of time they have to devote to clinical duties. But one thing that I do want to say is that this is probably not something that only female surgeons deal with. We shouldn't forget the single parent or non-traditional family units because some men may also have to deal with this quote-unquote family call. Nevertheless, this is a recent study published that polled practicing surgeons, men and women, with and without children. And in this study, men were more likely to be married, to have children, and to be married to stay-at-home or part-time employed spouses. Men were less likely to grocery shop, clean, do laundry, or meal prep. But they were more likely to perform household repairs and manage finances in families with children. So in families without children, both men and women shared the financial management equally. What this amounts to is a difference in the number of hours that men and women spend taking care of their families per week. So the most common responses from the women, they spent more than 12 hours per week caring for their families and their children. The most common response from the men, they spent 0 to 3 hours per week, which is less than 30 minutes a day, taking care of their family and their children. I do want to point out that the second most common response from the men was that they were spending more than 12 hours per week taking care of their family. And this might be because as this study found, surgeons, whether they were men or women, who had full-time employed spouses were more likely to do domestic tasks. So how are we doing? Well, we've already seen the global map. Some states actually offer paid family and medical leave laws locally, but North Carolina is not one of them. At Atrium, we do have parental leave. So you can take 4 weeks of paid parental leave and you're offered 100% of your base salary. And if you give birth, you can take 6 weeks of leave and you're offered 100% of your base pay, just that short-term disability helps to account for some of that pay partway through your leave. At Ortho Carolina, it's more complex because it's a private practice. It's a shareholder company. And so for the physicians who are the owners and the shareholders, if they want to take leave, then it involves shareholder discussions to iron out the logistics. For their employees, there's no paid parental leave, and so it defers to FMLA. They are offered 12 weeks of time. The payment, though, comes out of a combination of PTO or vacation time, as well as short-term disability. We don't have an individual department policy, but we do follow GME and ACGME guidelines, which essentially follows the Atrium maternity leave policy. And we definitely follow the ABOS requirements too, so that we can sit for our boards. Now, again, this will change in a few short weeks where we will be offered 6 weeks of time of paid leave. Through Atrium, we're also eligible for financial assistance if we want to adopt. And we don't have on-site childcare at Atrium, unfortunately. They will cover up to 30 days of transitional childcare after you have a child. For OC employees, they actually have access to on-site childcare through Novant, and it's essentially a hospital daycare, which I've heard is really excellent. We're given, as residents, double lead when we start the program, as you guys know, and then we have maternity lead available at all of the sites we rotate at. Atrium will also cover oocyte retrieval and egg freezing for female employees. So the average cost for this procedure is about $10,000. Once you meet your deductible, Atrium will cover the rest, except for a few medications that you might have to pay for out of pocket. Lactation policies at Atrium essentially is just early communication between the teammate and the team leader, and then encouraging leadership support to be sensitive and accommodating to a lactating mother's needs. We've had a recent increase in lactation facilities, actually, and this is thanks in part to one of our extended family members, Dr. Alexis Young. She advocated for more lactation facilities after her first pregnancy when she found that there were not really that many available to female surgeons. So here are some of the facilities we have available. On the left is in the Med Ed building. On the right is actually a freestanding pod in Levine Children's Hospital. And then there's the female locker room, of course. This is the newly constructed room at Mercy. But the best one I've found is actually at One Day Surgery because it has everything that you might need. So there's a lock on the door. There's a chair so you can sit. There's a fridge. There's a pillow for comfort. And most importantly, there's a sink so you can wash your hands and wash your pump parts. And there's a plug. Okay, so one of the themes that I saw when I was doing my literature search was this call for transparency, right? Like so often we share our stories with people who are like us, but if we want to spark change and discussion, we have to share our stories with everybody. So that's what I want to do here for you guys today. And I actually think we do things really, really well here. And so most of the things I have to say are good. A couple are bad, but I think it has to be said anyways. So going back to 2019, my husband and I both turned 30. I was a PGY2, but we felt like it was the right time for us to try and start our family. Early in 2020, I found out I was pregnant, so thankfully I was not one of those women who suffered from infertility issues. And then very early on, I experienced probably the only negative experience that I can recall, and I call it the lead incident. I was like 5 to 8 weeks pregnant. I had only told like 1 or 2 close friends, and I was at a surgery center. I grabbed the maternity lead, and one of the script techs promptly told me, "You can't use that because you're not pregnant." And I didn't say anything at the time because I didn't want that scrub tech to be the first person in orthopedics that I told that I was pregnant. And in hindsight, maybe I could have done something differently, but I ended up just standing as far away from the C-arm as I could so that nobody noticed that there was something weird going on. But I tell that story because I think it's so emblematic of some of the cultural issues we have where I didn't feel comfortable advocating for myself and my child because of worry of negative perceptions. And luckily nothing bad happened. And then shortly after that, I told everyone that I was pregnant, and I had an overwhelming amount of support from you guys and from faculty. The rising chiefs that year actually called me personally to express their support. And then Doctors Pat and Scannell changed my schedule around so that I would be on their services in my third trimester, and after I had given birth. And so I'm eternally grateful for that. One of the things that I think we should consider, though, is why that kind of flexible scheduling is even necessary in this culture. And so that might be something for us to talk about. And then COVID happened, and frankly, it was a bad time to be pregnant because I missed out on a lot more training than I really would have liked to. I spent a lot of time in clinic and not a lot of time in the OR. But as you guys know, we had a lot of free time, and so I got to get outside and work out and stay physically fit. And I attribute that to why my pregnancy was a lot easier and my recovery was a lot faster than I think it would have been. So when we came out of lockdown, I actually started on night float, and I almost got gestational diabetes during night float, which lends itself more to the question of what we're doing to our bodies, all of us, when we flip our schedules like that. Thankfully, I didn't get it. I did get carpal tunnel, which I still deal with today, sadly, as a surgeon. And Dr. Scannell had to start closing our wounds for us because I literally couldn't feel my fingers. I preemptively made up one call before I gave birth. And then 37 weeks, I made it to term. And this is me and Dr. Pat stopping to take a picture during a tumor case to celebrate. I operated through in 39 weeks. And then at 40 weeks, we had our baby. And unfortunately, I was one of the women who had an unplanned C-section. So that made my recovery a little bit harder. But I took a little under 7 weeks of maternity leave. My husband only got 5 days from his program, and we spent 3 of those days in the hospital because of my C-section period, a lot more difficult. And it really was not a walk in the park because I was recovering from surgery, figuring out being a new mom. I studied for OID, and anecdotally, it would have been much more helpful if he had had longer paternity leave. So then I started back on trauma, and I got to work with some amazing men who were unendingly supportive of me. By 3 months postpartum, I had made up all the calls that I had missed. We had a lot of issues finding childcare, as most of you probably know at this point. So my parents moved in with us for almost a year and a half, actually. And then at 1 year, we celebrated May's birthday, and I celebrated breastfeeding for 1 year. And that was thanks to the help of many, many people. I had attendings who let me use their offices, their clinic spaces. I had PA and NP friends who encouraged me to actually eat lunch so that I had calories. And I had co-residents who were supportive as well. And finally, a little over a year and a half later, we've got a stable childcare plan, we've got routine, we've got normalcy, and things are really good. So some general conclusions. What I hope to have showed you today is that parenthood in orthopedics it's a workforce issue. And so I really think we should move away from thinking about it as a female resident or a female surgeon issue. We've started to make changes as a group, but there's a lot more work to do, I think. We should strive for transparency and awareness. One way we can do that is with standardized and flexible policies. But most importantly, I think we should normalize starting families and taking leave. We should allow incentives to new parents, both men and women, so that we can all have some work-life integration. And then we should also offer support to our colleagues and minimize bias whenever we can, because ultimately we're all a team and this is an issue that affects all of us. I'd like to thank all of these people for their help with my talk and also for my journey the last couple of years. Here are my references, and I'll open it up to some discussion.
Thanks, Elaine. One of the questions I had as you're going through it, and this comes up, and we talked about it too when we were kind of putting together your schedule and talking about time off and everything. And I think you alluded to it, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on things. So you had kind of alluded to what plastic surgery board is doing. So one of our big limitations from a training standpoint is how many weeks our trainees have to have on average to be able to sit for boards. Mm-hmm. And where it becomes really challenging for women and for men too taking leave is probably right at that second child mark. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, we got creative a little bit in case we needed to. You know, but what are your thoughts on sort of, you know, current ABOS restrictions, I would probably call them, more than anything else, and maybe what we should do as a society to push for some change?
Yeah, I had this conversation with you, with Dr. Pat, with Susan, in case I wanted to have another child in residency. And luckily for me, I haven't taken that much vacation. So actually for me, I have some flexibility with that if I chose to use it. But I think it would take some planning and some awareness on the residents' part to say, okay, I'm interested in having multiple children in residency and I want to take a fair amount of leave when I do that. And so pre-planning, so maybe in your first year as an intern, you don't take as much vacation time because you know that you're going to use it on the back end of residency, would be helpful. That's really the only thing I can think of, right, is knowing, okay, yes, I get 6 weeks per year, but if you want to take more than that or have multiple kids, you have to pre-plan for it. I mean, and it does take awareness of what policies are available to you. And so you have to self-educate. I think the new ACGME requirement is going to be interesting. I actually looked it up. So they require the 6 weeks, but they leave it up to the individual programs to decide if a resident or fellow can take that 6 week period multiple times throughout residency. And so that's something that we'll have to decide as a national board of orthopedic surgeons and also individually on program level. You know, the other thing would be you could take, like, if you were to have more than two, if you want to have 2 kids, you could take 4 weeks for each. And that's better than taking 6 weeks and then just 1 week for the second, which I know that some women do. Yes, Kelsey.
Dr. Scannell, this is sort of piggybacking on your question. Do you think as there's been sort of a push or trend toward more competency-based evaluation and competency-based assessments rather than time within residency, do you think that things like that might be able to help this kind of policy change? Maybe we're not requiring these 46 weeks strictly. If we can, you know, if you can check that people are competent in these areas, do you think that's something that would play into if the board revises their policy too?
Yeah, I mean, I personally think that policy should be revised. You know, so I'll come out and say that. I'm not.
Be careful about coming out against the board.
Yeah, I know. I just took my.
I've already sent some nasty emails the past 2 weeks, so I got to cool them before.
Yeah, I think. Not to get off track too much from the parenthood piece, but I do think that we're actually starting some discussion in the U.S. with ACGME, ABOS, and the RRC on competency-based education. There is a group that I will be fortunately part of, starting to meet in August. Competency-based education has definitely been going on for a while, other places. I think we're a little bit behind the time. So I do think that is one way, along with perhaps some policy reform as well, to kind of help.
Particularly with the data that you presented, that the time away doesn't seem to impact people's performance down the road. It just seems like those sort of things would go hand in hand.
Yeah, I agree.
I have a question for you, Elaine, as well as Dr. Scannell, as well. Thanks. This is an awesome talk, and I appreciate you sharing your own experience. Did you read anything about programs being able to use what they call sort of research months, which we don't have here? But you know, I could imagine that might be an easy way to frame kind of like more family time and not officially call it paid leave. And I don't know, Dr. Scannell, if we've talked about research months in other venues for other reasons, but I'm curious to know if that could be a possible sort of easy fix so that you're not violating any restrictions, but still essentially not having clinical duties for residents who need to take leave.
So I'll let Elaine answer first.
Short answer is yes. Some programs do offer that, and we're one of them. So this goes back to the having multiple kids discussion. Dr. Scannell actually sat me down and said, listen, if you want to have another child, then we can totally do it. We might consider basically taking a research, labeling you as having a research month, and you can just do a research project during that time. It doesn't count against you. So yes, people have thought about it. Yes, people are doing it. It's a good solution. Eric.
Yes, I think one of the really interesting things you mentioned was childcare, and my story is a little bit interesting in this regard because my wife is obviously not a resident, but is a doctorate level educated hospital employee. And after giving birth, I took off about a day and a half. And that caused all of the burden to fall on her. And because of that, she's never gone back to work. And so her career has been put on hold, essentially because of the way that our training programs work. And you had mentioned the child care at Novant, and it made me pause because I think if we had that here, my wife would still be working, with the obvious financial and career implications for our family. I was just curious if you saw anything about, what percentage of training programs offer that type of thing, because as we have worked through this, one of the things that we discovered is that there is not a daycare in Charlotte, and we looked at all of them, where I could either reliably drop off or pick up.
Yeah.
And therefore I'm useless.
Yes. I have many thoughts. So
but when it comes to daycare, I'm completely unreliable, and that caused 100% of the burden to fall on her. With in multiple regards, and as it came to childcare, that was what resulted in her being out of the workforce for an extended period of time.
So there's no data on programs that have like on-site childcare available. Yes, I think that's something Atrium should work on because it would be helpful. Yes, there are no daycares available where I can do anything about it. So we actually have 2 different nannies and daycare. But the question I would ask back to you is whether or not you felt like, now knowing that taking leave doesn't impact training outcomes, would you have taken more time to help your wife get set up for the caregiving burden?
So I wanted to and didn't feel like I could.
Yeah.
Because I felt pressure not to miss work. And I felt like at the time I was on joints, and I felt like I would be viewed differently if I had done that. And so it was negotiated over text messages with the attending I was on, who said, no, take the day off before your wife gives birth. You shouldn't be here that day. And then it was left completely open-ended after that. And I felt like there was no verbalized expectation of when I should come back. So I was back before the end of the week.
Yep. Dr. Shing.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to highlight a little bit about, especially as a trainee, especially as a surgeon, you can't necessarily have the amount of time that people that have a different type of a job have, but there are certainly quality times and there are windows of time that are more important. Probably one of the most important windows of time as a parent of young children, and fortunately I've had an experiment in professionalism by having a young child at age 50. This time between the end of the workday and the designated bedtime for that child is probably one of the most critical time, whether you're the primary caregiver or you're the parent coming home to relieve that primary caregiver. And I think that we as leaders have an opportunity to respect that time for the people that are our trainees, that are our other employees that work with us. And I think to a certain extent, COVID has helped in that if there is not a training event, like a hands-on cadaver lab or something like that, that has to be done in person, or a case that's extended or something like that, that has to be done in person, those quote unquote meetings or events or whatever things can be moved to a time frame after that child or children have gone to bed.
Yep, I completely agree with that. That's how I've set up my own life too. I mean, a lot of you, probably everyone in this room has tried to like call me at some point. I'm like, okay, after 7:30, because that's when May goes to sleep. So.
Should we move all the cadaver labs up? Great, yeah.
I would be happy to do them all after 8. I can tell you that I have seen people falling asleep on their feet trying to do some of this. So I think outside of in-person things, that you have a critical skill set or something. And part of the issue is too, some of the labs won't stay open that late. Like for the skills lab really likes to shut it down around 8:30. So being respectful of that, but those are more rare situations. But we have routine meetings and, journal clubs and all these other things, which probably would be much better done in later evening hours for those people who have younger children. It's a completely different ballgame for younger children.
It's different for everybody. So it's different with different age kids. It's different with different partners. And when that quality time is for partners, for your family. And so that I think is the challenge. Joe's exactly right though. That quality time piece, you were kind of getting to the parenthood piece at the end. That quality time is the most important. And there are plenty of times where I think myself, do a really crappy job at that. And fortunately, I have a partner who does a really good job of resetting me with that too. So,
Can I say something?
absolutely, Dr. Gant.
Elaine, great talk, and I'm glad we're having this discussion. I'm sorry, I sorry for interrupting there. I'm about to go into the OR, so I just wanted to throw some thoughts in. But I think the key thing is also in orthopedics, going back to what Eric said, that there has to be, the only way these things get better if the male partners actually take paternity leave. Like, if that becomes normalized, if that doesn't become a stigma for male residents, male partners, for people to get involved in that. And we can see that this is an American problem. This is somewhat artificial. We see in Europe and other countries equivalent to our kind of economy that paternity leave is normalized. It's not considered weakness. It's not identified in that way. And the culture of surgery, like, this is radical, what I'm about to say, but the culture of surgery is set up that makes parenting hard, because I would say a critical touch time when kids are of school age is being there in the morning before they go to school. We had a European surgeon travel with us a couple years ago and couldn't understand why our OR started at 7 o'clock in the morning. They could easily start at 9:30, 10 o'clock. That would help the nurses, who are predominantly women. They would love that touch time in the morning with their kids. I mean, we have a culture that is set up basically in a male-dominated way that explains basically most of those men having female partners that stay at home, which Eric brought up. If your wife is a professional, you end up having to decide which career is important. So again, this is the way we've set it up. It doesn't have to be that way. Other countries are also taking care of their patients, and it doesn't happen that way. So from the very beginning, it's just set up against, family, and it's like male or female. But we start the OR early, we have meetings early, they could be delayed, the whole process could change. And I bet a whole bunch of women running the operating rooms would love that as well, not just the surgeons. So you brought up a lot of good points. I'm sure Dr. Casey and myself and any other female doctor, Dr. Ozier, we could just tell you crazy stories 20 years ago trying to have children. And so things are way, way better. So I do applaud, but they're partly better because you had to put in institutional requirements on this. But like, when I told my director that I was pregnant as a resident, he was like, oh my God, like, I could just see Dr. Skolko's face right now. He was just basically like, we're gonna put you on, it's gonna be the research month. And, I was gone for like 4 weeks, 5 weeks, and that was it. It was like my research block, and we just didn't even talk about it. There was no written policy. So things are way better, but they'll get even better if our male residents we have more male residents, if they felt comfortable and male partners felt comfortable taking paternity leave.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, Dr. Gant. Thank you for sharing that. Is anyone else online who wants to ask questions or make a comment?
Excellent.
Thank you.
Nice job.